Hey folks, quick video here on feminist political theory. This topic, this content has a special place in my heart, as I may have discussed previously, or at least will discuss in later videos. My interest in political theory really got going with a class I took on Marx and other things that I had enjoyed, Aristotle, Plato, various other topics. But class I took on Marxism really got me interested. But what really put me over the top and sent me to grad school was a course I took on feminist political theory that I feel like I was really fortunate to just sort of stumble on towards the end of my undergraduate period. And it really just blew my mind that this perspective, I put here, right, a perspective that helps us evaluate and improve our political theory. I was blown away by the power of this perspective to help us read, compare, evaluate, alter, change um, work by Aristotle, Plato, Marx, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, all of these people that we've been studying, and then all the way up to contemporary theorists. That right, like these are theories, Plato versus Aristotle, that we've been debating and considering for hundreds or thousands of years as they've gone away and reemerged. And I think that some of the biggest advances in political theory have come from the application of a feminist lens to these questions. And so, the idea that we today in the 21st century can be reading these texts and considering these ideas like liberty and the good life and legitimate political authority and the bounds of the state and all of these things, and be making significant advances within our lifetime. And a lot of this stuff is late 20th century. But it was astounding to me, right? I mean, I think that like feminist theory is one of the things that really showed me that political theory is an academic discipline that's alive and well. And I think one of the things that we'll come across in this video, hopefully, is that many of the best practitioners in different areas of political theory um, sort of gained a lot of their insight through a feminist lens, right? They're not just philosophers of women; they are philosophers and political theorists of the highest order. So let me get rolling here, right? So as I'm saying here, it's women's rights, right? We think of the feminist movement, we think of feminism as being about women's rights, and it is. But feminist political theory and feminist interpretations of political theory, I think, are more than that, right? So, and sorry for the small type here, but right, we have that. Yes, it is about advocating for the consideration of women's interests and rights, 100%, right? This idea that women have been given the shaft in terms of their role and their consideration in traditional political theory. They're ignored or they are demeaned or devalued consistently throughout the history of political theory. All the things, for the most part, that we're reading in this course. But that gives us sort of two broad sets of options here. One, well, if we grant access to theories of justice and perspectives that say what is just, what is legitimate, what is tyranny, what is human rights, if we give those kinds of consideration to women and not simply men, we expand the reach of political theory to half the population. And in doing so, we also, we may just apply things like property rights or things like, pluralism or individual rights or, you know, uh, the need to educate and cultivate virtue in individuals. We apply all that to half the population that was excluded, and that's powerful. We also might refine some of these applications in the sense that we'll see later on that for a lot of political theorists of various persuasion, the family and the private sphere and the household, was just sort of like this black box area that was off limits. Like we're not going to apply any of our political theory to those areas. We're going to ignore them. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on in there, and we might simply extend some of our existing perspectives in political theory from the the traditional canon um, to those areas, and we might come up with some really interesting insights about life and about various institutions that we haven't really considered. Um, but we might also, right, number two here, we might also change the canon to be fair across genders if, from a modern perspective, um, we believe that everyone is of equal value, regardless of your gender, and that a viable and legitimate political theory treats everyone equally and of equal importance, regardless of their gender. Then that might lead us to alter some political theories, right? Make some significant changes. Go back and say, well, if Aristotle believed this as we do, he would have to make these changes to his theory, or Locke or Hobbes or all of these people. It might lead us to compare different political theories, like as we did in our first segment of this class. Well, geez, there's a lot to like about the way Plato deals with gender. Maybe that is a strength of his theory. Or I'll say later on that John Stuart Mill, as he presents his theory his liberal theory um, of individual rights and focused on ideas of liberty. The fact that one of his great insights was the need and the benefit of applying his theory to women in his famous work, The Subjection of Women, that speaks really well for his theory compared to other theories that maybe went along or justified or naturalized or normalized the oppression of women. And so it might lead us to reject some theories, right? Maybe they can be adapted to a feminist lens, but maybe they can't. And maybe those are just theories that are not as good as other ones and that we need to let go. And so, all of this, how do we decide the best social contract theory? I don't know. Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, they all seem to have their virtues. Maybe this is a lens that tells us, one of them is able to adapt to or consider or already does consider women in a useful manner, in a accurate or legitimate manner, and the others don't. Well, that might help us decide which is the best social contract theory. Which is the best ancient theory of the good life, Plato, Aristotle. Maybe that helps us decide or evaluate. And speaking specifically of the way it helps us transform our political theory canon, I think this second item, the way it leads us to reconsider assumptions about human nature, is so central. Because as you have seen so far, in every ancients, moderns, to the extent that we did the medieval folks, everyone is trying to figure out what people are like and therefore how they should live and what kinds of institutions will allow or facilitate the best life given human nature. And what if we have been just messing up our, broadly and systematically our understanding of human nature, right? So again, like there might just be the add women and stir, right? This is the lowest bar, I think, for feminist theory. The add women and stir, add any group that was excluded, that didn't get the application, that didn't get that first thing in terms of political theory. Well, add them in, all right? So there's a lot of political theory, and you get this out of the Okin reading. You get this out of Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill are great advocates of this. You get this back in Plato too, right? This idea of, well, do women have a nature that is somehow different from human nature? Which, right, the default, the natural, the neutral being male nature, or as Wollstonecraft will say, like, aren't women humans too? Aren't the virtues and the needs and the wants and the abilities and the capacities of humans also belong to women? Oh yeah, right. Like that might be a point of bias. that just gets broken through, and we expand our concept of human nature to apply to half of the human race, right? That would be an extraordinary thing. But also, I think, going to number two in this idea of, again, altering, um, do gender roles, which we know are at least partially, if not primarily, socially constructed, right? The question that we always face with these ideas of the state of nature and human nature in the state of nature is how much is what we consider to be natural, right? Aristotle had this problem too. How much is what we consider to be natural simply an observation about the way people behave in a particular place and time in society? And one of the replies that when you look at something that is socially constructed like race or gender, it's like, well, it means different things in different times and places. So things that, right, you might assume to be natural or normal, roles, behaviors, traits, characteristics, they might not be natural at all, or at least not natural in the way that they're being expressed. And so maybe our understanding of human natures is distorted by social forces that make us think a particular way to live is the only way to live. And what kinds of examples do we have that? Well, I mean, a classic one is, humans are rational and women are emotional, right? This gets back to this idea of women's nature versus human nature. And what really, when you have a society that is deeply, deeply divided in terms of uh, perceptions of gender roles and capabilities, you get this idea of men are the standard for humanity, but in defining that standard, we're defining them against the other being women here, right? So I have this little cartoon graphic here where so much of Western political thought is focused on this idea of rationality, and our conception of what is rational, what rationality consists of, and our persistent need or determination to divorce abstract, front brain, higher rationality from the body, which increasingly psychology and neuroscience and modern science of thought and cognition and all of that says there is no divorcing of those things, right? Like your gut connects to different parts of your brain, core lizard brain parts of your brain that have knowledge that is not directly accessible to your front brain. We know this increasingly, and your emotions are in fact a way to add both meaning and information and processing to sort of higher cognition, and to abstract away from one. Say that one is good and the other is bad, right? Women are emotional. That's the bad, rejected part. Men are rational, higher brained. That's the part that makes us human and that gives us dignity. People like Immanuel Kant said that was the source of human dignity. I think that those are all distortions of what makes us human, right? The idea that what makes us human, what makes us special, are the things that make men different from women. The other, right? We talk about othering a lot. Where's my othering, right? I think, and I'm teaching in my FYS this book, Mama's Last Hug, by primatologist Franz de Waal, who makes this argument about the way we look at animals. We associate animals. I think there's a very, very interesting parallel here. This is one of the things I went to grad school to do, saying, oh, like maybe I could do some of this thinking, like feminist theory, referring to animals, where, well, we have this obsession with the idea that the things we have in common with other animals, or with animals, as we would say in the vernacular, those can't be the good things, the valuable things, the important things about what it means to be human. The things that are important and make us human and are therefore important to our lives and should be valued in politics and society and institutions and ethics are the things that make us different from the rest of animal creation. Well, that's a very distorted way of thinking, right? Like suffering is essentially common across animal creation, as are various types of cognition, but particularly emotion. Well, So we devalue those things because they're associated with devalued forms of creation. And in doing so, we create this false sort of weirdly abstracted version of human nature. And I think that, right, not to get off track with the animal question, but it seems to me that that's a more extreme version, though perhaps not as central a version as the gender dynamic, as this, this dynamic here. I think just says so much, right? That all of this stuff here, we don't want it. That's not the good part of what it means to be human, and that's not the part we're going to consider in terms of social contracts and rational choice and things like that. And even you go back to Plato, who gets a lot of props from the feminist theorist community, and he has his triangles with reason at the top and desire at the bottom, and it's right, like this odd worshiping of rationality over desire might not be a correct view of what it means to be a fully developed human being, right? So traits, roles like roles in the family, like parenting, like mothering, like care, that are associated with a devalued class tend to themselves be devalued and sort of read out of human nature. So all the parts of being that are associated with women, all the roles in society that are associated with women, tend to get excluded from conceptions of what it means to be a human. And the role within the family is a major one, and this is, even further a blind spot, in the sense that, we've come to appreciate that the family is the primary institution that distributes resources between different individuals that are within the family, that distributes power. Who's agreeing to the social contract? In many of these cases, the assumption is heads of household, men at the head of patriarchal families. And as many of our theorists that we're going to read or that we are reading right now talk about, well, to the extent that education, that shaping people to be their best, most virtuous forms, is a goal or a necessity to a better political form, right? Plato recognized this, and he moved on the family issue. But people like Machiavelli and Rousseau really, sort of dropped the ball on their discussion of the family. And later theorists, particularly Mary Wollstonecraft, is going to be, I think, make a really powerful argument of like, no, like this is the primary place in which we shape people. So if you are not going to have a just, well-formed family, right, which is in the primary interest of the state to shape what the family is like, you're not going to be able to produce those citizens that run a more just form of government. And so again, getting into this third part, right? What is the good life? What is the life that we're trying to develop for people? Is it an independent, autonomous, choosing kind of life? Pick your life path for yourself. Well, then we might be denying that to opportunity to women. Is it a life where or is it a life that should be considered more communal? Right, a lot of the characteristics associated with the family, living in cooperation, in harmony with others, helping, caring, giving. Roles as the mother and the caretaker and the nurse and the teacher, and all of these roles that tend to be associated with women. Maybe these are, more central to the good life than what Aristotle thought with, well, what it means to be a good, fully formed human being, living the most excellent, the most perfectionist, right, perfect perfectionist life, is to be a politician debating ethics and policy, in the forum with other highly educated, males that have no concern for the domestic. Right? He says the domestic has to be taken care of by women and by slaves, to let the truly wonderful stuff of life be accessed by those lucky few who are fit for it. And right? It might less be the exclusion than like what is wrong with the family and the domestic and the economic, as Aristotle says. Maybe those things are better parts of life. Maybe they're central parts of life compared to participation in politics. All right. So I'm moving a little bit slowly. Let's try to get through this in 10 minutes. Football's coming on. Um, I think that it's easy to think of feminist theory and think, oh, it must be like a set of views. And there is a feminist theory of every flavor. Feminists are engaging in all of the other main areas of thought that we're dealing with, and so you have liberal feminists, you have Marxist feminists, you have postmodern feminists. I have here you have difference feminists or feminists that are concerned with the virtues and the shaping of people like Republicans, like Rousseau. Rousseau was one of these people, but he was not a very good feminist. But Mary Wollstonecraft might be an example of this. I should have her on there. I put her up with the liberals. Up here, but she also shares a bit with this sort of what we might call Republican feminism, where the virtues of the different genders might be considered. So we have all these different types of feminism, and let me just go through these quickly, right? So liberal feminism, Lockean tradition, ending with Rawls in the modern tradition. This idea that hey, right, the good life is the life of the individual autonomous person who's free and equal and able to choose whatever they want for their own life. They're able to direct their life and be protected from harm from others dominating them or hurting them. And right, liberal feminists say, yeah, and women too. Women should have that too. So Susan Moller-Okin is probably the biggest name in liberal feminism that we're reading. She is just a monster in terms of the way she tears through the canon. Just a brilliant mind. John Stuart Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft would be in the canon. People who stand in for this liberal feminist position. I would note also that my master's thesis advisor Martha Nussbaum is a particular sort of brand of liberal feminist. And she's a good example, one of the very, very, very most important philosophers alive today, working today. She is perhaps the leading Rawlsian. She has been at various times in her life the leading proponent of sort of a modern Aristotelian approach, like doing the best work in the various areas that she's working in. And she was led there through her feminist lens and her application of different parts of the canon to the question of what you might call third world women. Particularly, she was working on women in India, and her capabilities approach is the most important modern perfectionist virtue ethic theory. Right? It combines Aristotle and Rawls, and again, this theory that she does. That she's produced today derives from her feminist leanings, and it has produced perhaps the best theory accounting for the role of disability and how disability can be integrated as a status and a concept into liberal society. She's also written probably one of the, if not the most important person writing on justice for animals, and she's also written some stuff that I think is less successful about applying Rawls and liberalism to international international relations and care for people in other nations. But the point here being that we have people working as feminists, but they are doing some of the most important work in other parts of political theory as well. And by the way, right, we'll see later on, Martha Nussbaum, Judith Butler, vigorous to the point of SmackDown WWE kind of level opposition in terms of their views about feminist theory and political theory writ large. Marxist feminism, right? This idea that that yes, class oppression is based on material divisions of the ownership of the means of production is central to structuring society, and that our ideologies around race, religion, gender are superstructure elements that support the current distribution of the means of production. And feminist Marxism takes this really seriously as a or the or one of the sort of central ideologies that sustains inequality in modern society. And feminist standpoint theory, associated with people like Nancy Hartsock, is, I think, one of the best expressions of standpoint theory. It's one of the clearest and most powerful, and talks about the experience of women as a critical theory that unmasks ideology and systemic bias and systemic oppression in society. I threw Kimberly Crenshaw in here. She is one of the leading voices of critical race theory. She's also a leading, critical theory feminist. And the leading voice or the leading developer of the concept of intersectionality, taking this idea of feminist standpoint and a Black feminist standpoint and other kinds of intersectional perspectives where multiple oppressions overlap. It's one of the most popular and most powerful pieces of political theory that we utilize all over the place today. You see it throughout the academy. You can't go to a talk at McDaniel without hearing discussion of intersectionality. And so, right, this again comes out of Marxist theory, critical theory, but developed in a really, really useful and powerful way by these feminists. I also think, we talk about post-structuralism and Foucault. I think that Judith Butler is probably the leading voice of postmodernism in the world today. This idea that language and categories of gender or other categories, right, are socially constructed sources of power and oppression. They structure our lives. They structure the way we think, and that deconstructing these categories, and particularly binary categories, opens up new ways of living and being that are freer and more human. That right, again, some of the best, most powerful postmodernism is applied to gender, but then becomes a leading source for understanding postmodernism. So, right, there's this back and forth between concern for women and the theory, where the theory can liberate women. Liberating women can improve the theory, and I think that at its best, that's what we're talking about. In terms of difference feminism, right? I mean, I think this is a really interesting and at times at odds here, times at odds up here with the liberals. Traditionally, the difference feminists and the liberal feminists went at it. The liberal feminists and the Marxist feminists went at it. The liberal feminists and the postmodernists, right, went at it, because the liberal feminists are to a large degree the standard bearers of the liberal philosophy that's dominant in America and in the West today. The difference feminists, people like Carol Gilligan, embraced this idea that biologically or through a psychoanalytic concept called object relations theory, the relationship of the formative relationship of babies, of infants to their mother, right, the caretaker, that this structures men and women, males and females, in fundamentally different ways. This feels a little outdated at times, but I think that it's worth noting, right, that whereas liberal feminism assumes a equality in capacity and need and want and role and all of these things between people of all genders, difference feminism entertains the idea that there are differences, and what those differences, how that has played out, is that again, traits, ideas, roles that are associated with women are devalued in society. That they're not included in our conceptions of power. That they're not included in our conceptions of good leadership. That they're not included in our conceptions of productivity and merit and desert as what makes someone a good citizen, what makes someone a good contributor, and that we should instead of saying men and women need to fill the same roles and have the same virtues and the same natures, we should simply give equal value to their differences. Right. This is again, this was very popular in the 70s and 80s. And right, you still see it when you hear people talk about how political systems work better when women are given leadership roles, right? When Nordic countries that have better representation of women in parliament and presidencies and prime ministerships, that they are better, more peaceful, more cooperative, less corrupt. That there might be virtues of women that can be folded into the system to produce a better political system. And the most extreme form of this is the ethics of care, which I'm not going to go into, but this had its moment as the first really interesting alternative, along with maybe the land ethic and kind of environmental eco ethics, often equal feminist ethics. There was a big overlap there as alternatives to sort of more rational, traditional views of ethics like utilitarianism and rights-based deontology and that kind of thing. I won't get into that, but as you can see, there's such a diversity of views in feminism. It is a perspective that simply asks, what have our views on women, what have our concerns on women done to our theory and done to our conceptions of politics and ethics and society? And it can go in any direction from there, right? And finally, I just want to note one of our readings, one of our authors here, Susan Muller-Okin, just a giant. I'd also, I didn't in that last slide mention Iris Marion Young, who is perhaps the most interesting late 20th century theorist of democracy and group politics. And again, right, these advances, these interesting contributions to theory, often coming out of the observation of exclusion and dysfunction in the way we've been thinking about it, right? What have we been taking for granted? Iris Marion Young is a theorist who talks about things like the possibility of the group veto on policy that affects it. Consensus as the model. We've talked about that in the social contract, right? The idea of rationality and rational individuality as being sort of in the social contract a stand-in for consensus. Well, we all agree to it because we all have the same minds. Well, if we take group difference seriously, then it might be, instead of every individual agreeing to the contract, maybe every key salient social group would need to consent to the contract for it to be fair and for it to be just. Iris Young, right, with this more consensus model of democracy being one of the really interesting, difficult but really interesting areas of democratic theory in the late 20th century. Susan Okin, again, as I mentioned before, a giant. Her work that really busts onto the scene and that you see a little bit of in our readings for this class, or when she talks about how sort of the cornerstone of Plato's Republic are these two sort of paired observations, that women and men in book 5 have equal capacities and can play equal roles, including philosopher queens. A lot of people just are like, oh, philosopher queens. Like, that's sort of a fun, interesting wrinkle. She's like, no, like, this is the heart of what's going on in the Republic and the redesign of society. And because of these equal capacities, and because of a devaluation or a skepticism about the family, right, which divides people into their own little private silos, Plato replaces the family, for at least the guardians and the auxiliaries, with a state communal education and rearing that is essential, absolutely essential to getting the communal project of the Republic across. So these two things, the devaluation or the replacement of the family and the equal capacities of women, are paired together, make each other possible, make each other necessary, perhaps, in Plato's Republic. And they are the things that are the foundation for Plato, argues Susan Okin, of a radically different way of living, right? A radically different way of living than currently we were. It's a source of new virtue and new community commitment, and it's only possible through this gender equality. There are other things to be said here. I'm not doing justice to her, but just worth noting. Similarly, we've got a little bit on Rousseau that she writes about in her classic consideration of Western political thought. And this applies to a lot of the social contract thinkers, but specifically with Rousseau, this idea that his commitment, his sort of unswerving commitment to gender roles, distorts his views of human nature and civic virtue and education and the possibilities for educating a virtuous public, and his need to have women's virtue be a separate and distinct thing is really destructive to his view. It really undermines the ability for him to achieve some of his goals about a more unified community. And Mary Wollstonecraft, I note here, just really, like she's a fan of what Rousseau is doing. But I think she points out very persuasively that Rousseau's gender bias just leads him in the wrong direction, and it leads him to miss the boat on what on the potential of his own theory. So I think that's very interesting here. And then most recently, like she's a contemporary. She's no longer with us. She's a contemporary of John Rawls, and she is one of the few points. Rawls was the most famous late 20th century political theorist, and so it was Rawls versus everyone. Everyone's doing battle with Rawls. Everyone's critiquing him, criticizing him, applying him. Nussbaum, as I said before, right? She's a big Rawlsian. Okin is probably the best example of someone who went toe to toe with Rawls, and Rawls blinked. Right? Rawls said, "Yep, I got that wrong. You're right." Right? Essential to Rawls's theory is this idea that justice is fairness, that people would only contract into a society where the major social, political, and economic institutions were structured fairly. And Okin says you've left out the family, like with Hobbes and like with Locke. You talk about individuals as heads of households in your theory instead of actual real individuals who have real individual rights. And what would happen if we applied your theory of justice as fairness with your social contract hypothetical using the original position in the veil of ignorance, all things we'll talk about. What if you applied that to the family? You didn't know what your role was going to be in the family. Well, then you would choose to structure the family in a fair way so that no matter what role you occupied in the family, it would be fair, and it would promote those liberal goals, right? She's a liberal feminist of developing autonomy and freedom and equality amongst the members of the family, just as we promoted amongst all individuals in society. And doing so, right, it hits both a big blind spot, arguably, of Rawls's theory, and a blind spot that hides a lot of other potential bias. And one of Okin's big issues is that claims about multicultural values, right, of families forcing certain roles upon subordinate members, children, women within that family, for the sake of culture and religion and things like that, right? And the most obscene ones will be questions like female genital mutilation, where given the power differentials in a family, you might have young women forced to do things that significantly degrade or destroy their autonomy and their ability to choose different ways of living when they become adults. And Okin says that's, right, like that's where it's going to hide if you carve out this space in your liberal theory and say, well, the family, the private sphere, that's something else. Justice only applies to the public sphere. Well, all of the bias, all of the oppression is going to run into that big private sphere that you carve out. And so Okin really challenged this public-private divide in a way that a lot of people, including Rawls himself, were like, oh, wow, like, I didn't really consider it. I didn't recognize my biases on this point, and my bad, right? Like I would like to change that in my theory of justice, the most important or at least prominent theory of liberal governments and liberal justice. of the late 20th century. All right, so I think that's it for today. Hopefully, you guys get a sense of how much I'm a believer in this. I think that there's a strong parallel here with critical race theory that we've already studied. These critical theories that right, they don't just throw out everything. Right, Susan Muller Okin is a good liberal. She thinks Locke, she thinks Rawls, she thinks going back to Plato. These people have valuable insights that can be liberatory to women and to all people. But she takes a critical edge, a feminist lens, and looks at them and questions, what do we keep? What do we apply? What do we throw away? And I think that it's such a fascinating area of political theory. All right, folks, thanks. That's it for me.